You are a woman. The year is 1186. The sun has not yet risen, and you are already awake, not because you want to be, not because you set an alarm. There are no alarms, there are no clocks. There is only the gray suggestion of dawn creeping under the door and the very immediate awareness that if you don't get up right now, the fire will go out, the bread won't be started, the children will wake up hungry, the animals will need feeding, and the entire fragile structure of daily life that depends on you, specifically personally, entirely on you, will begin to crack before the day has even properly begun. So you get up. This is, in broad outline, the story of what women did all day in the Middle Ages. The honest, unglamorous, largely unrecorded, absolutely essential version. Not the version with the princess in the tower waiting to be rescued. Not the version with the courtly lady dropping her handkerchief for a passing knight. Not even the version with the noble abbess, serenely illuminating manuscripts by candlelight, though we will absolutely get to her, because she deserves her moment. The version we're telling today is the one that historians spent most of the last century slowly, carefully, painstakingly reconstructing from household accounts, and coroner's records, and court documents, and guild archives, and the occasional diary, and the more than occasional complaint. Because women in the Middle Ages left records, just not always the kind that got preserved in the obvious places. And what those records show, when you read them carefully, is something that should probably not be surprising, but somehow still manages to be. Women in the Middle Ages were extraordinarily busy. Not busy in the modern sense of having a full calendar and too many notifications. Busy in the sense of performing every single day a volume and variety of physical and skilled labor that most modern people would find genuinely difficult to comprehend. Busy in the sense of keeping entire households, communities, and economies functioning through work that was absolutely essential and almost entirely invisible to the people writing the official histories. Because here's the thing about medieval historical sources. They were written mostly by men, mostly by educated men, mostly by educated men in religious institutions, and they were written about the things those men found interesting and important. War, theology, politics, the movements of kings, the decisions of councils, the great events that shaped the fate of nations. Women appeared in these sources when they did something remarkable enough to be noted, when they ruled kingdoms, led armies, founded religious orders, committed crimes sensational enough to end up in court records, or when they were specifically the subject of a religious or moral treatise explaining what they should and should not be doing. What they did not appear in, consistently, was the record of ordinary daily life. The woman who got up before dawn, every day for 40 years, and kept her household functioning, who raised her children and processed her wool, and brewed her ale, and tended her kitchen garden, and assisted at the births of half her village. She mostly didn't make it into the chronicles. She was too ordinary, too fundamental, too much a part of the background of daily life to be remarkable enough to record. And yet she was there. She is recoverable if you look in the right places. And the picture that emerges when you do look, when you piece together the household accounts, and the manor records, and the guild registers, and the medical texts, and the archaeological evidence, and the occasional window that a particularly observant contemporary writer left open onto the daily life of actual women, is a picture of extraordinary complexity, extraordinary competence, and extraordinary resilience. Today we're going to look at that picture. We're going to look at women across the full range of medieval society. The peasant woman in her field, the urban craftswoman in her workshop, the merchant's wife managing a business empire from her counting house, the nun in her cloister, the noblewoman running an estate in her husband's absence, the queen playing three-dimensional chess with the politics of two kingdoms simultaneously. We're going to look at what they actually did, how they spent their actual days, what skills they had, what power they exercised, what constraints they operated under, and what they managed to accomplish anyway. And we're going to start, as all things in medieval life ultimately started, at the very bottom of the social pyramid, before the sun comes up, before the fire has been lit, in the cold dark of an early morning in the medieval countryside. because that's where most women's days began, and understanding where they began is the only way to understand everything that followed. Chapter 1. Before the sun rises. The morning routine that would destroy you. Let's be specific. Let's put you in a particular place, at a particular moment, so you can feel the weight of it. You are a peasant woman in rural England. The year is approximately 1250. You are somewhere between 25 and 35 years old. Though you look older, the sun and the work and the childbirths have done their business. You share your house, a 2-room structure of timber and daub with a thatched roof and a beaten earth floor, with your husband, 3 living children. You have had 5. This is not unusual, and you carry the knowledge of the other 2 in a quiet part of yourself that you don't visit during working hours. A pig that winters inside because the cold would kill it otherwise, and an indeterminate number of chickens who have decided that the threshold between inside and outside is a matter of personal interpretation. The fire has been banked for the night, carefully because fire is precious. Because starting a new fire from scratch with a flint and steel and tinder is a genuine undertaking, and because your fire is not just warm, but also the means by which all food gets cooked and all water gets heated. If the fire goes out, your morning gets significantly harder. The first thing you do when you wake up is check the fire. This is not a conscious decision. It is the automatic first action of a person for whom the fire represents a critical resource. You coax it back to life, add fuel, and while it catches, you begin the morning. The children are still asleep. This is a small mercy. They will wake up hungry, and they will wake up soon, which means the bread, started last night, left to rise overnight, needs to go into the oven, which means the oven needs to be ready, which means the outdoor clay oven needs to have been heated with a fire inside it, burned down to coals, scraped out, and loaded with bread before the morning gets much further along. This sequence of events takes time and attention and physical effort, and it is where your morning begins. While the bread bakes, you will know it's done partly by timing, partly by the sound of the crust, partly by a knowledge built up over years of baking in this specific oven with this specific clay that no recipe book could ever have taught you. You do the other morning things. You milk the cow or the goat, if you have one. In the pecking order of medieval peasant assets, a milk-producing animal is significant, and the milking cannot wait. An unmilked animal is uncomfortable and will produce less milk over time. You carry the milk inside. You feed the pig, who has opinions about the timing of this that it expresses loudly. You let the chickens out, noting which ones seem off, and which seem fine, because a sick chicken represents both a loss of eggs and a potential loss of future meals. And this matters. You wake the children. You deal with the children. Anyone who thinks that dealing with medieval children was somehow simpler or less demanding than dealing with modern children has never spent time with children of any era. They are hungry and loud, and one of them has managed to get into something, and the baby needs changing. The fabric bindings used as diapers need washing, which means more water needs heating. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, the bread is done, and your husband is awake, and he also needs feeding before he goes to the field. It is at this point approximately 1 hour after dawn. You have been awake for 2 hours. You have done more physical work in those 2 hours than many modern people do in a full workday. And your day has barely started. This is the thing that the historical record, when it condescends to describe women's daily labor at all, tends to compress into a few words. Women managed the household. Women attended to domestic duties. These phrases, passive and bland, do no justice whatsoever to the reality of what managing a household meant in a world without running water, without gas or electric heat, without preserved food beyond what you had salted or dried yourself, without any of the labor-saving infrastructure that makes modern domestic life possible. Let's dwell on the water problem for a moment, because it is genuinely important and genuinely underappreciated. Medieval households did not have running water. Water came from a well, a spring, a stream, or a river, and it got from that source to your house by being carried. In buckets, in jugs, in pots, by you. A medieval household used water for drinking, for cooking, for washing people, for washing clothes, for washing dishes, for watering the kitchen garden, for the animals, and for 100 other purposes. All of that water was carried, by hand, from the water source to the place where it was needed. This was not a 10-minute task, depending on how far the well or stream was from your house, which varied enormously by location, from 20 feet to half a mile. Water carrying could consume a significant portion of a woman's daily labor. A study of the actual physical demands of pre-industrial water carrying estimated that a medieval peasant woman might carry the equivalent of several thousand pounds of water per year in the course of her ordinary domestic duties. That's not a metaphor for how hard life was. That's a literal calculation of the physical load. The fuel problem was similar. Your fire needed feeding, and the fuel, wood, peat, dried dung in some areas, had to be gathered, dried, stored, and brought to the fire as needed. Wood gathering was a regular part of the female domestic labor cycle in many regions. Women and children gathered fallen wood from common lands, bundled it, carried it home. Again, physical labor, recurring, essential, invisible to the chroniclers. Now let's add the food preservation dimension, because feeding the family in the middle. Ages was not a matter of going to the store and buying what was needed. It was a year-round strategic operation involving the processing and preservation of seasonal foods, so that the household could eat through the winter and into early spring, when the gap between the previous harvest's stores and the new season's produce could become genuinely dangerous. You salted meat in autumn, usually from animals slaughtered because there was not enough fodder to feed them through the winter, packing it into barrels with salt, hoping the salt had preserved it adequately. You dried herbs from the garden during summer and hung them in bundles. You preserved fruit, drying it, making it into preserves if you had access to honey for sweetening. You stored root vegetables in cool, dark conditions. You managed the grain supply carefully, knowing exactly how much you had, calculating how long it needed to last, rationing as necessary. This was not casual household management. It was a resource management operation requiring planning, numerical reasoning, knowledge of food science, even if not understood in those terms, and the ability to make decisions about present consumption that would affect survival months in the future. A woman who miscalculated the winter stores, who fed the family too generously in November and ran out of grain in February, was not making a minor error. She was potentially contributing to a food crisis. Medieval coroners' records, which are among the most valuable sources for the daily lives of ordinary people because they record the circumstances of sudden or suspicious deaths, give us glimpses into the physical reality of women's daily routines that are sometimes startling in their specificity. Women drowned in wells while drawing water. They were scalded by overturned cauldrons. They fell from ladders while gathering fruit or thatching roofs. They were killed by falling trees while collecting firewood. The hazards of daily domestic labor were real, and they were sometimes fatal, and the coroners reported them with the unadorned practicality of people for whom accidental death was an ordinary event. These records tell us something important. The physical environment of medieval women's daily labor was genuinely dangerous. The open fire in the center of the room, or later against a wall with a chimney, was a constant burn hazard, particularly for children. Hot liquids in heavy iron pots were difficult to manage safely. The physical strength required for some domestic tasks, lifting full grain sacks, moving heavy furniture to clean under it, hauling water in quantity, was substantial, and the margin for error was sometimes narrow. What's also striking about the coroner's records is that women appear in them not just as victims of domestic accidents, but as people moving through the world in the full range of activities their daily lives required. Women are recorded dying while working in the fields, while driving animals along roads, while going to the mill, while helping neighbors, while visiting markets. The picture that emerges is of women who are not confined to the domestic space, who were, in fact, continuously moving through the world around them as their work required. This corrects a persistent misconception. The idea that medieval women, particularly peasant women, were essentially confined to the home. The actual evidence suggests something much more mobile. Women went to market. They interacted with neighbors. They worked in the fields during peak agricultural seasons. They went to church regularly because church was a social as well as religious institution, one of the few spaces where people of various conditions gathered in the same place. They made journeys, sometimes long ones, as pilgrims, as traders, as people following the economic opportunities available to them. The kitchen garden, the small cultivated plot, immediately adjacent to most peasant dwellings, was typically women's domain, and it was not a hobby. It was a serious food production operation, growing vegetables, herbs, both culinary and medicinal, possibly soft fruits, and in some cases, fiber plants like flax. The kitchen garden produced food that the household ate regularly, and that supplemented the grain-centered diet with nutritional variety. Tending it was skilled agricultural work, knowledge-intensive and labor-intensive, but because it happened close to the house, rather than in the larger fields, it has historically been classified as domestic rather than agricultural, and thus has been systematically undervalued by historical analysis. The distinction is, of course, largely artificial. Planting, tending, harvesting, and processing the produce of a kitchen garden is agricultural work by any reasonable definition, but because it happened on a small scale and was done by women, it ended up in the household category rather than the farming category, and has consequently been invisible in economic analyses of medieval agriculture. Recent historians have been systematically correcting this, and the corrected picture makes medieval women's contribution to food production considerably larger than the older scholarship suggested. Let's also talk about the children, because they are present in every aspect of a medieval woman's daily life, in ways that the sources record obliquely but persistently. Medieval childhood mortality was high. Perhaps a third of children died before their 5th birthday, and further losses in childhood and adolescence were common. Women navigated repeated pregnancy, childbirth, a genuinely dangerous event in a world without modern obstetric care, infant loss, and the care of surviving children against this background of constant mortality risk. The management of children's health, recognizing illness, deciding on treatment, knowing what herbs or preparations might help and which would harm, knowing when a situation was beyond home treatment and required the assistance of someone with greater medical knowledge, was largely women's work. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was not exclusively professional. It circulated in communities, passed from woman to woman, from mother to daughter, accumulated in the form of household recipe books when literacy allowed, or oral tradition when it didn't. This medical knowledge was real knowledge, even when filtered through frameworks we would now consider wrong. The herb garden was a pharmacy, the knowledge of which plants eased fever, which helped with pain in childbirth, which were dangerous in pregnancy, which helped a congested chest. This was not folk superstition separate from real medicine. It was the primary medical resource available to most people most of the time, and it was primarily kept and transmitted by women. The morning is almost over. The bread has been eaten. The children have been dispatched to their own small chores, or to school if there is one nearby, and your child is attending it, or to help a neighbor. Your husband has gone to the field. The fire is burning steadily. The pig is fed. The cow is milked. The water for the day has been brought. And now the real work begins. Chapter 2. The Peasant Woman. Backbone of a world that pretended she didn't exist. You might be tempted at this point in our morning to assume that the rest of a medieval peasant woman's day was more of the same. A repetitive cycle of domestic tasks, unvarying from one day to the next, from one season to the next. If so, you would be making the same mistake that most medieval chroniclers made, and that much early medieval scholarship made after them. The reality was considerably more dynamic, considerably more seasonal, and considerably more connected to the broader economic life of the community than the domestic label suggests. Let's talk about the agricultural year, because the rhythm of the agricultural year structured everyone's life in medieval Europe. Men and women but women's involvement in agricultural labor was more extensive and more central than the traditional picture allows. Medieval agriculture was organized around the three-field system in much of northern Europe. One field planted with winter grain, wheat or rye, sown in autumn and harvested the following summer. One planted with spring grain or legumes, oats, barley, peas, sown in spring and harvested in late summer, and one left fallow to recover. The rotation of fields meant that farming was a year-round activity, with different fields requiring different attention at different times. Women worked in these fields. Not all women, not all the time, but the idea that agricultural fieldwork in the medieval period was exclusively male is simply wrong, and the documentary evidence makes this clear. Women's agricultural labor was seasonal and task-specific. It tended to concentrate at the peaks of the agricultural calendar when the work outstripped the available male labor supply, and every available pair of hands was needed. Harvest was the most important of these peaks, and it was a genuine community emergency. The window for harvesting grain was narrow. If the weather turned before the harvest was in, the consequences could be catastrophic. During harvest, everyone who could work worked. Women and children joined men in the fields, cutting grain with sickles, gathering it into sheaves, binding the sheaves, carrying them to be stacked. This was physically intense labor performed in the hottest part of the year, in the full sun, with the weight of the year's food supply hanging on whether it got done fast enough. Women's contribution to harvest was so essential that it appears in the manor accounts, the detailed administrative records kept by medieval estates, as a standard and expected element of the labor due to the Lord. When a manor recorded the labor services owed by its tenants, women's harvest labor was often specifically included. When harvest workers were hired for wages, because manorial lords often supplemented their unfree tenants' labor with paid day laborers during harvest, women appear in the wage records, paid at rates that were typically lower than men's but real and recorded. Haymaking, the cutting and drying of hay for winter animal fodder, was another peak labor moment that involved women extensively. So was gleaning. After the main harvest was complete, the poorest members of the community, including many women and children, were permitted by custom to go through the harvested fields and collect the grain left behind by the reapers. Gleaning rights were legally recognized in many parts of medieval Europe and were a crucial food source for the landless poor. They were exercised almost exclusively by women and children. The threshing of grain, beating the harvested, sheaves to separate the grain from the stalks, was heavy physical work traditionally associated with men, but women's participation was not unknown, particularly in smaller household operations where there wasn't a clear division of labor. Winnowing, tossing the threshed grain into the wind to separate the grain from the chaff, appears more consistently as women's work in the pictorial sources. Manuscript illustrations often show women winnowing. Dairying was, across medieval Europe, predominantly women's work. The care of dairy animals, cows, goats, sheep being milked, the milking itself, the processing of milk into butter and cheese, the management of these products for household use and for sale. This entire complex of activity was primarily female territory. In regions with significant pastoral economies, particularly in upland areas where cattle were central to the agricultural system, dairying could represent a substantial part of the household's food. Production and its cash income from selling dairy products at market. Cheese-making in particular was a skilled operation. Different cheeses required different processes, different temperatures, different timings, different handling of the curds, different aging conditions, and producing good cheese consistently required knowledge and attention that was genuinely craft-level skill. The woman who made excellent cheese could sell it at premium prices at the local market. She might build a reputation for it. In a modest way, she might be known for it. One of the few paths to anything like public professional recognition available to an ordinary peasant woman. The marketing of household products was another aspect of women's economic activity that the traditional picture consistently underplays. Medieval markets, The weekly or twice-weekly markets that were a feature of most towns of any size and many larger villages were spaces where women operated as regular economic participants. They sold dairy products, eggs, poultry, garden produce, ale, cooked food, cloth, and other household products. They bought what the household needed and couldn't produce itself. Salt, iron goods, specialized cloth, spices if they could afford them. In the market, a peasant woman was not a dependent following her husband's economic decisions. She was an independent economic actor, making her own transactions, managing her own small commercial relationships, building the kind of market knowledge that came from regular participation, knowing which sellers were reliable, which prices were fair, when to hold goods and when to sell them. This market participation was economically significant and socially important, connecting women to the broader commercial world in ways that the domestic label completely fails to capture. The legal records occasionally give us glimpses of women's economic independence that are genuinely startling in the context of a society that officially treated married women as subordinate to their husbands. The legal doctrine of coverture, by which a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's, was the official framework. But the actual operation of medieval law and economy was considerably messier, and women appear in court records making contracts, owning property, pursuing debts, being pursued for debts, suing their neighbors, and being sued by them. The doctrine of fime sole, the legal status of a woman trading independently, separate from her husband's identity, was recognized in medieval English law, and the records of some medieval towns show married women trading in this capacity with their own accounts and their own legal standing in commercial matters. In London particularly, the records of women's independent commercial activity in the 13th and 14th centuries are extensive enough to make it clear that the gap between the official doctrine of female legal subordination and the actual practice of women's economic activity was sometimes very wide indeed. Let's talk about ale, because ale in medieval England deserves its own moment, and it connects directly to women's daily economic activity in ways that are fascinating and somewhat unexpected. In the medieval period, before the rise of large-scale commercial brewing, which happened gradually through the later medieval period, ale was made at home by women, and it was a household staple. Medieval ale was not the modern beer. It was unhopped. Hops came into English brewing relatively late in the medieval period, from continental practice. Lower in alcohol than modern beer, and it went bad relatively quickly, typically within a few days of brewing. This meant that ale needed to be brewed frequently, weekly or more, in any household that used it regularly, which was most households, because ale was safer to drink than water of uncertain purity and provided calories in addition to fluid. Women who brewed ale for household consumption were called alewives, but many alewives didn't stop at brewing for their own households. They brewed extra and sold it, to neighbors, to travelers, to the increasing number of people passing through or living in their area who needed to buy ale rather than brewing it themselves. This small-scale commercial ale selling was one of the primary ways that peasant women participated in the cash economy. The assize of ale, medieval legislation regulating the price and quality of ale sold commercially, produced records that allow us to identify alewives across many English towns and villages. And what those records show is that ale selling was overwhelmingly female, widespread, and economically significant at the household level. In some villages, the majority of households were selling ale, at least occasionally. In towns, women ale sellers were a constant commercial presence. The transition from small-scale female ale selling to large-scale, male-dominated commercial brewing is one of the clearest examples in medieval economic history of what happens when a predominantly female economic activity becomes sufficiently profitable to attract male competition and capital investment. As the scale of commercial brewing grew and the profit potential became more obvious, men and institutional capital moved in. By the end of the medieval period, the commercial brewing industry was increasingly male-dominated, and the alewife had begun her transition from economic actor to comic figure. The stereotype of the dishonest, shrewish alewife cheating her customers that appears in late medieval literature and drama being, among other things, a cultural strategy for delegitimizing women's presence in a commercial space that was being taken over by men. But for much of our period, the alewife was a real and important figure in the rural and urban economy, a woman exercising genuine entrepreneurial skill, managing production and sales, dealing with customers, navigating the regulatory framework of the assize, and contributing meaningfully to her household's cash income. The picture of the peasant woman that emerges from all of this, from the morning fire to the harvest field, to the dairy, to the market, to the brewing vat, is not the picture of a dependent, confined, passive figure waiting for her husband to determine the household's fate. It's the picture of someone working at the center of a complex economic operation, exercising multiple skilled competencies simultaneously, making dozens of decisions daily that affected the household's well-being, and participating actively in the economic life of her community. She was, by almost any reasonable definition, an essential worker. The term didn't exist, the recognition didn't exist, or existed only in the most oblique ways, but the reality was there, visible to anyone willing to look at the evidence carefully. And now let's look at the skills more specifically, because the range and depth of knowledge that an ordinary medieval woman was expected to possess, and did possess, is one of the aspects of medieval women's history most likely to genuinely surprise a modern audience. Chapter 3: The Craft of Survival. Spinning, brewing, healing, and every other thing. Let's talk about what you had to know to be a woman in the Middle Ages, not what you were required to know by official decree, or what the church said you should know, or what the courtesy literature of the period recommended. What you actually had to know, in practice, to do the job of being a woman in a medieval household. To keep your family alive, your household functional, and your community supplied with the goods and services it needed. The list is long. The list is frankly humbling. Start with textiles, because textile production was so central to women's daily work across all social classes that it has become the defining symbol of medieval female labor. And the symbol is earned, even if the full reality is considerably more complex than the image of a woman quietly spinning by the fire suggests. Textile production in the medieval period, before the development of large-scale commercial textile industries, happened primarily in the home, primarily by women. The raw materials, wool from the sheep, flax from the garden or field, arrived in an unprocessed state and had to be transformed through a sequence of skilled operations into finished cloth. This was not a simple process. Wool, as we know from our previous discussion of medieval clothing, had to be cleaned, carded, or combed to align the fibers, spun into thread, plied, twisting 2 or more threads together for strength, and then woven or knitted into fabric. Each of these steps required tools, knowledge, and practice. The drop spindle, used for spinning for most of the medieval period, with the spinning wheel gradually spreading through Europe from the 13th century onward, looks simple, but is not. Producing thread of consistent thickness and twist requires developed muscle memory and sustained attention. Good thread was worth money. Bad thread produced bad cloth, and bad cloth was worse than no cloth. The spindle whorl, the small weight attached to the drop spindle to maintain its rotation, is one of the most common finds in medieval archaeological sites. They turn up everywhere, in peasant houses, in noble houses, in urban contexts, in rural ones. This ubiquity reflects the ubiquity of spinning itself. It was a constant background activity performed by women of all classes, wherever and whenever their hands were not needed for something more urgent. The image of a woman spinning is so constant in medieval visual culture that it became the primary female symbol. The distaff and spindle are to medieval women what the sword is to medieval men. But spinning was only the beginning. Weaving, transforming thread into cloth on a loom, was another skilled operation. Medieval looms were substantial pieces of equipment, and the management of warp and weft threads to produce cloth required both the technical knowledge of how to set up and operate the loom and the sustained physical effort of the weaving itself. In some households, weaving was a male occupation, particularly in commercial textile production, or shared between men and women. In many rural households, the loom was primarily a female tool, and the cloth it produced was primarily a female product. Beyond simple weaving, there were more specialized textile crafts that women practiced at various levels of skill. Embroidery, the decoration of fabric with needlework, ranging from simple repairs to the extraordinary artistic achievement of pieces like Opus Anglicanum. Tablet weaving, the production of decorative braids and borders using a set of small tablets. Netting, braiding, and various forms of decorative thread. Work. These skills could be purely domestic, producing embroidered decoration for household items, working decorative borders onto family garments. Or they could be professional, practiced as a commercial skill by women who sold their work to individuals, to churches, or to commercial workshops. The embroidery workshop was one of the significant female professional spaces of the medieval period. Commercial embroidery, producing vestments, decorated textiles, and high-end household items for sale, was practiced in workshops that employed women, sometimes exclusively. In London's Cheapside district, commercial embroiderers, many of them women, produced work for the luxury market, for the church, and for royal and noble clients. The women who did this work were skilled professionals, not domestic dabblers. Their work commanded high prices and was recognized as skilled craft production by the guild system, even as the guild system also consistently tried to limit women's full participation in it. Which brings us to the guild question, because women's relationship with the medieval craft guilds was complex, contested, and revealing of the broader contradictions in how medieval society thought about women's work. Medieval craft guilds were the primary professional organizations for skilled craft workers in urban environments. They regulated the quality of work, controlled entry into the trade, set prices, negotiated with civic authorities, and maintained the professional standards of their craft. In theory, guilds were exclusive bodies that controlled who could practice a particular craft professionally. In practice, women's participation varied enormously by craft, by city, and by period. In some crafts, silk working, embroidery, certain areas of cloth production, women dominated, and the guilds associated with these crafts were predominantly or exclusively female. In Paris, the silk women's guilds of the 13th century were among the most organized female professional bodies. In medieval Europe, with their own statutes, their own officers, their own regulatory authority over their craft. These were not informal associations of women doing a bit of extra work at home. They were formal professional guilds with real commercial power. In other crafts, women participated as the wives and daughters of male guild members, doing the work, sometimes all of it, but doing it under the legal cover of their husband's or father's guild membership rather than their own. When a craftsman died, his widow often continued the workshop, sometimes for years, sometimes for the rest of her life, operating under his guild status and training apprentices under his name. This was so common in some crafts that it was effectively a standard career path. Become a craftsman's wife, learn the business thoroughly, continue it after his death. In still other crafts, women were explicitly excluded or their participation was restricted to certain lower status aspects of the production process. The tendency visible across the medieval period for well-paying skilled work to gradually become male-dominated as a craft became more economically successful is consistent enough to constitute a pattern. Women's work was acceptable when the economic stakes were modest, but when a craft became genuinely profitable, institutional forces tended to restrict women's access to its full benefits. The healing arts represent another domain of women's knowledge and practice that sits awkwardly in the historical record. Significant, essential, and only partially visible. Formal medical education in the medieval period was university-based, Latin literate, and almost exclusively male. The university-educated physician, trained in Galenic theory, practicing humoral medicine, consulting learned texts, was a figure of professional authority who was also largely inaccessible to most people most of the time. You needed to be in a city. You needed to be able to pay substantial fees, and you needed to be dealing with a condition serious enough and recoverable enough to make the consultation worthwhile. For the vast majority of the population, rural, poor, or moderately poor, far from urban centers, the primary healthcare provider was not the university physician. It was the women in their community who had medical knowledge. The local woman known for her skill with herbs, the midwife who attended births, the older woman who had accumulated decades of experience treating common complaints and could advise on what had worked before. This informal female medical practice is enormously difficult to quantify because it operated in the oral tradition and in the household rather than in the literate institutions that produced historical records. But it surfaces in various ways, in the household recipe books that survive from the later medieval period and contain extensive medical sections, alongside culinary ones, in the occasional legal case involving accusations of harmful medical practice, in the records of midwifery as a recognized, if poorly documented, profession, and in the persistent presence of women in the more formal margins of medieval medical practice, as nurses in hospitals, as bath attendants in the bathhouses that served therapeutic functions, and occasionally as practitioners recognized by civic authorities, even in the absence of formal credentials. Hildegard of Bingen, the extraordinary 12th century German abbess, mystic, theologian, composer, and natural philosopher, produced medical texts that drew on both learned tradition and practical knowledge of plants and healing. She was exceptional in her learning and in her visibility, but she represents a broader current of female medical knowledge that was less exceptional and less visible in women across the social spectrum. The midwife deserves particular attention because childbirth was both one of the most dangerous and one of the most exclusively female-managed events in medieval life. Male physicians did not attend normal births. Childbirth was a female space, managed by the midwife and surrounded by the female neighbors and relatives who served as the support network for the laboring woman. The midwife was a recognized professional figure in most medieval communities, though her formal training was entirely practical, learned from an experienced midwife rather than from a university. And her status varied considerably by region and period. The danger of childbirth in the medieval period was real and widely understood. Women died in childbirth. They died from hemorrhage, from infection, from prolonged labor, from 100 complications that modern obstetric care can manage, but medieval practice largely could not. The prayers and votive offerings directed at saints associated with safe childbirth. Margaret of Antioch was particularly invoked. Reflect the genuine terror that surrounded this event. Women approaching their time prepared spiritually as well as practically because the possibility of death was present and recognized. The midwife managed this process with the tools available: practical knowledge of the mechanics of birth, the ability to position a poorly presenting baby, herbs known to stimulate contractions or ease pain, the physical support of her presence and experience, and the ritual and spiritual support of prayers and protective objects. She could not perform surgery. She could not treat serious infection. When things went badly wrong, her options were limited. But for the successful management of normal births, her knowledge and skill were essential and real. Beyond the specialized knowledge of healing and midwifery, ordinary women's medical knowledge covered the practical management of the ailments and injuries that a family encountered in the course of daily life. Fevers, infections, injuries, skin, conditions, digestive complaints, the various ailments of children. The herb garden was the pharmacy, the knowledge of which plant to use for what was the pharmacopoeia. Women learned it from their mothers, from their neighbors, from the occasional written source if they were literate, and from their own accumulated experience. This knowledge was not perfectly effective by modern standards. How could it be? Operating without germ theory, without antibiotics, without the diagnostic tools of modern medicine. But it was not negligible. Many of the herbal preparations used by medieval women have been shown by modern pharmacological research to have genuine efficacy. Willow bark for pain and fever contains salicylate compounds that are the active ingredient in aspirin. Garlic has genuine antibacterial properties. St. John's wort has real effects on mood. The medieval herbalist, working without understanding why something worked, was sometimes, nonetheless, working with something that did work. The management of food, cooking, baking, preserving, brewing, was a knowledge domain so extensive that it deserves its own chapter rather than a section. But let's acknowledge its depth here. The medieval cook, working without a thermometer, without standardized measures, without the consistent fuel supplies and controlled heat sources of a modern kitchen, produced food through knowledge of technique, material, and sensory judgment that represented real expertise. Bread baking, in particular, managing the fermentation of a sourdough culture, reading the dough, understanding the behavior of a clay or stone oven, was a skilled craft. Women who did it badly produced inedible or unhealthy bread. Women who did it well produced the staff of life, day after day, year after year. The knowledge required to run a medieval household, even a modest peasant household, was, taken together, enormous in scope. It encompassed agriculture, animal husbandry, food production, and preservation, textile production, basic medicine, brewing, commercial exchange, childcare, household management, and a dozen other domains. A woman who possessed all of these competencies in full working order was a formidable person. Most women did. They had to. And yet, and here is the enduring paradox of women's history in the medieval period, the official ideology of the time insisted that women were the weaker sex, weaker in body, weaker in reason, more susceptible to sin, requiring the governance of men. The church taught it, the law enforced it, the literature reflected it, when it reflected women at all. The gap between that ideology and the daily reality of what women actually did, what they actually knew, what they actually contributed. That gap is one of the most fascinating and revealing features of medieval history. And we've only gotten through the peasant woman's mourning. We haven't yet visited the urban craftswomen's workshops, or the merchant's counting house, or the abbess's scriptorium, or the noblewoman's estate office, or the queen's council chamber. All of that is coming. The women of the medieval world were everywhere, doing everything, and we're going to find them all. Chapter 4. The City Woman. Craftswomen, traders, and the urban hustle. You're standing in the middle of a medieval city. Let's say London, sometime around 1320, because London in the early 14th century is a particularly rich case, large enough to have a complex, differentiated economy, well documented enough that historians can reconstruct its commercial life in reasonable detail, and messy enough that the gap between official ideology about women's proper place and the actual behavior of London women is entertainingly wide. The city around you is loud. It is also extremely smelly. The combination of animals, open drains, tanneries, dyers' workshops, fishmongers, and a few 100,000 people living in close proximity produces an olfactory environment that no modern city comes close to replicating. The streets are narrow, the buildings lean toward each other overhead, and the noise is constant. The cries of street vendors, the hammering of smiths, the clatter of cartwheels on stone, the bells of the churches, and there are a great many churches, the general collective noise of an urban population going about its business. And that business, that urban commercial business, involves women at every level, in every sector, in ways that the official story of medieval women consistently fails to capture. Let's walk through the city and see who we find. Here is a woman selling cooked food from a basket at a street corner. Pies, pasties, roasted meat wrapped in bread, hot food for the significant population of urban workers and migrants who don't have kitchen facilities and depend on street food for their daily meals. She has made this food herself, starting before dawn, and she will sell it through the morning and into the afternoon. She knows her regular customers. She knows her prices. She knows which competitors are nearby and what they're selling. She is, in modern terms, running a small food service business. In medieval terms, she is a huckster or regrater, a retail food seller, a category of commercial activity so heavily female that the words for it are effectively gendered. Around the corner, a woman at a stall is selling cloth. Not the great bolts of imported Italian silk or Flemish broadcloth that dominate the major cloth merchants' businesses, but the more modest retail end, local woolens, linen, the everyday fabric that ordinary households needed to buy when their own production wasn't sufficient. She buys from larger merchants and sells retail. This is a legitimate commercial operation subject to market regulations, and she is its operator. Down a narrower lane behind a house whose ground floor has been converted into a workshop, a woman is working silk. Specifically, she is throwing silk. The process of twisting raw silk thread into the stronger, more usable twisted thread called thrown silk, which is then woven into silk fabric. This is skilled work, organized through the London Silk Women's Network, which was one of the most economically significant female professional organizations in medieval England. The London silk women of the 14th and 15th centuries are worth dwelling on because they represent medieval female commercial organization at its most sophisticated. Silk working in medieval London, the importation of raw silk, its processing into thrown silk and finished silk goods, and the retail sale of silk products was dominated by women to an unusual degree. The silk women imported their own raw materials, organized their own production networks, trained their own apprentices, including controversially male apprentices, which generated legal disputes about whether female masters could train male apprentices within the guild framework, and sold directly to wealthy consumers, including members of the royal household. These were not marginal figures operating in the interstices of the male commercial world. They were major economic players, wealthy, organized, politically connected enough to petition Parliament when they felt their trade interests were being threatened. In 1455, a group of London silk women did exactly that, petitioned Parliament complaining that Italian merchants were importing finished silk goods that competed with their own production and asking for protective legislation. They got it. This is a group of medieval women successfully lobbying Parliament in their professional capacity, and it happened. The silk women's case illustrates something broader about urban women's commercial activity in the medieval period. It was not just survival-level economic participation, but, at its upper end, genuine commercial power. The most successful urban businesswomen accumulated significant wealth, employed significant numbers of workers, and operated in the upper reaches of their respective commercial sectors. But let's not spend all our time at the upper end. Let's look at the full range. The retail food trade, selling cooked food, selling produce, selling dairy products, selling ale, was the largest sector of female commercial activity in most medieval cities. And it was also the most legally complicated because medieval cities had extensive and detailed regulations governing food sale, and women who sold food were subject to all of them. The assize of bread, regulation of the price, weight, and quality of bread sold commercially, applied to female bread sellers as much as to male bakers. The assize of ale applied to the alewives. The market regulations governing the sale of fish, meat, dairy products, and other perishables applied to the women selling them. And when women violated these regulations, sold short weight, adulterated their product, sold ale above the regulated price, they appeared before the courts and paid the fines. The court records of medieval towns are therefore a significant source for women's commercial activity because they record the violations and, by extension, the activity. The woman who appears in a London court record fined for selling ale above the assize price was breaking the law, but she was also running a commercial ale-selling operation of sufficient scale to attract regulatory attention. The woman fined for forestalling, buying goods before they reached the official market to resell them at a profit, was engaging in a practice so common among female retailers that it became a stock figure of male complaint literature. But she was also demonstrating market knowledge and commercial initiative. The regulation of female commercial activity in medieval cities was not just about ensuring honest weights and measures. It was also about managing the anxiety, clearly present in the documentary record, that commercially active women represented a challenge to the social order. The woman who made money in the market, who had her own commercial relationships and her own cash income, who made her own economic decisions, was a figure who didn't fit neatly into the ideology of female dependence and male governance. City authorities managed this partly through regulation, partly through the periodic restriction of women's commercial activities, and partly through the fiction that married women's commercial activity was really just an extension of their husbands. The legal doctrine of feme covert maintaining the theoretical subordination of wives, even when the practical reality was considerably more independent. Let's talk about the textile trades in more detail, because beyond silk, the urban textile economy involved women in a range of occupations that stretched from skilled craft production to low-wage piecework. In the major cloth-producing cities of Flanders, Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, the textile industry was the economic engine of urban life, and women were involved in almost every stage of its production. Spinning, as we've established, was women's work almost universally. The urban spinning workforce, women spinning at home for commercial textile producers who provided the raw wool and collected the spun thread, was enormous, and it was almost exclusively female. These women were not independent operators but outworkers, paid piece rates for their thread, dependent on the merchant who controlled the raw material supply. It was not economically advantageous work, but it was consistent and widespread. Further up the textile production chain, the situation was more mixed. Weaving, the skilled work of producing cloth on the loom, was organized through weavers' guilds that were predominantly male in the great commercial cloth-producing cities, though women's participation was not absent. Dyeing, fulling, and finishing were also primarily male-dominated in commercial production, but the sale end, the retail trade in cloth, saw significant female participation, and the production of the smaller-scale, more specialized textile goods, ribbons, laces, hats, caps, gloves, stockings, purses, was often female-dominated or heavily female. The cap makers and hat makers producing the linen coifs, wool caps, and other head coverings that formed a constant part of medieval dress were frequently women. The hosiers, makers of the knitted or cut-and-sewn stockings worn by everyone, included significant numbers of women. The glove trade, particularly at its retail end, was heavily female. These were not the prestigious high-end crafts of the guild system's inner circle, but they were skilled, productive trades that supported real commercial enterprises run by women. Let's visit a different kind of urban woman, the wife of a successful merchant or master. Craftsman, because her situation is, in some ways, the most interesting and the most revealing of the contradictions in medieval women's legal and economic position. You are the wife of a prosperous London goldsmith. Your husband has a workshop on Cheapside, employs 3 journeyman goldsmiths and 2 apprentices, and has commercial relationships with clients ranging from wealthy merchants to minor nobility to the occasional royal household. He is a successful man in a prestigious trade. And you, what do you do all day? The official answer, the one the law would give you and the church would endorse, is that you manage the household, care for the children, support your husband's work, and defer to his judgment in all things. You are a helpmeet, as the Bible instructs. Your sphere is the domestic. The actual answer is considerably more interesting. You manage the household, yes, a household that includes not just your family, but the apprentices who live in the household and are your responsibility. You feed them, you supervise their behavior outside the workshop, you provide medical care when they're sick, you manage the domestic space that is also a commercial space. The apprentice who does something wrong at home, who gets into a fight with a neighbor, who fails to observe the household's religious practices, who behaves improperly, is answerable to you as much as to your husband. You also assist in the workshop, because the distinction between household and business in a medieval craftsman's home was essentially non-existent. The workshop was in the front room. The business came through the front door. When a customer arrived and your husband was occupied, you dealt with the customer. You knew the inventory, you knew the prices, you knew which commissions were in progress and when they'd be ready. You may have done the bookkeeping or assisted with it. Literacy and numeracy among merchants' wives were higher than among the general female population because these were practically useful skills in a commercial household, and they were acquired and used. You also managed the commercial relationships that ran through the domestic space. The merchants who supplied raw gold and gemstones for your husband's work. They came to the house, and you dealt with them in his absence. The customers who needed to be entertained, hosted at dinner, offered hospitality as part of the commercial relationship. You managed that hospitality, and its quality was a direct reflection on your husband's standing. If your husband traveled on business, which merchants regularly did, you were, in his absence, the fully responsible head of the household and the business, not a substitute for him, consulting him at every decision, actually in charge, making the decisions, maintaining the commercial relationships, managing the workshop, handling whatever came up. This happened regularly, and it was understood to be part of what a merchant's wife did. The expectation was that she was capable of it, and the expectation was generally met. When a merchant died, his widow frequently continued the business. This was so common, so regular, and so expected that it was accommodated in the guild system and in the law, awkwardly and incompletely, but genuinely. Merchant widows appear in commercial records across medieval Europe, managing significant business operations, conducting overseas trade, managing large workshops, maintaining commercial networks that they had learned in the course of their marriages and continued after them. The widow of a successful merchant was sometimes one of the wealthiest and most commercially powerful figures in her community. The case of Alice Chaucer, grandmother of the poet Geoffrey Chaucer, wife of a wine merchant and later a wealthy London citizen, is one example of a commercially active medieval Englishwoman whose career can be traced in the records with unusual completeness, but she represents a type that was broader than the individual case suggests. The commercially experienced merchant's wife who moved from assisting her husband's business to running it, either in his absence or after his death, with the competence that came from having been doing it all along. The urban poor women deserve attention too, because they are the largest group and the most invisible. The women who worked as servants in wealthier households, domestic service, was one of the most common forms of female employment in medieval cities. The women who did laundry for pay. Laundry work, with its heavy physical demands and its access requirement to water, was outsourced from wealthier households to specialist laundresses. The women who worked as day laborers in various capacities. The women who sold their physical labor by the day or the task. These women are hard to find in the records precisely because their work left the least paper trail. We catch glimpses. The servant who appears in a household account as the recipient of a small wage. The laundress named in a list of urban taxpayers with a minimal assessment. The day laborer who appears in a wage record as a woman without a name, hired for a specific task at a specific price. The woman in the coroner's record who died in the course of her work. These glimpses, accumulated across many records, paint a picture of a substantial female urban working population performing essential services for the urban economy at the lowest wage levels and with the least legal protection. Women's wages in medieval cities were consistently lower than men's wages for comparable work, sometimes significantly lower, sometimes around 2/3 of male wages. This was not an oversight or an accident. It was a systematic feature of the medieval labor market, reflecting and reinforcing the subordinate status of women within the economic system. The woman working as a domestic servant occupied a particularly interesting position. She lived in the household of her employer, which provided food and shelter, but also meant that her working day was effectively unlimited. She was available when needed, which was frequently most of the time. She had little privacy and little legal protection against mistreatment, but she also had, in some cases, a degree of economic security that the self-employed poor woman lacked. regular food, regular shelter, and the occasional gift of cast-off clothing or small cash payments beyond her formal wage. Female servants were legally vulnerable in ways that go beyond their economic precariousness. The power imbalance between a servant woman and her male employer, or his male family members, or his male guests, was real and consequential. Medieval court records contain cases of sexual violence against servants, and they also contain cases of consensual relationships that crossed employer-servant lines and had complicated legal and social consequences, particularly when they produced children. The servant's pregnancy was a crisis in a medieval household. She lost her position, she lost her shelter, and she faced the social stigma of illegitimacy without the economic resources to manage it independently. The literature of medieval urban poverty is full of women in exactly this situation. The urban woman, across all her varieties, from the silk merchant to the street food seller, to the domestic servant to the craftsman's wife, was a constant and essential presence in the medieval city's economic life. She was there every day, in every market, in every workshop, in every domestic space. She was regulated, restricted, underpaid, legally disadvantaged, and ideologically diminished. And she kept the city running anyway. Now let's leave the city. Let's go somewhere that might seem, from the outside, to be the most removed from the commercial hustle we've just been navigating. Somewhere with high stone walls, and a locked gate, and the sound of plainchant floating over the garden. Let's go to the convent. Chapter 5. Behind the convent walls. What nuns actually did. All day you are a nun. More specifically, you are a Benedictine nun in a reasonably prosperous English convent, sometime around 1300. You have been here since you were 7 years old, when your family deposited you with the sisters, along with a donation that helped secure your place. You're now, let's say, 32. This is the only life you have ever known. It is, in many ways, the only life you will ever know. And it is considerably more complicated, more interesting, and more demanding than most people, then or now, give it credit for. Let's start with the basic structure of the day, because the monastic day was organized around something that no secular life had in quite the same way: the liturgical hours, the divine office, the cycle of prayers and chants said or sung at specified times throughout. The day and night was the backbone of monastic life, the framework around which everything else was arranged. There were 8 canonical hours: matins in the middle of the night, lauds at dawn, prime, early morning, terce, mid-morning, sext, midday, none, mid-afternoon, vespers, evening, and compline, before bed. This means that a medieval nun was getting up in the middle of the night, typically around 2 or 3 a.m., to sing matins in the church, returning to bed for a few hours, and then beginning the day's work. The sleep deprivation this schedule involved was not incidental. It was, to some degree, intentional. One of the disciplines of monastic life, the mortification of the body's desire for comfort and rest in the service of spiritual devotion. In practice, most convents made accommodations for the practical impossibility of running a functioning institution on severely fragmented sleep, but the basic structure remained. Between the liturgical hours, the Rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational document governing Benedictine monastic life, specified that nuns were to divide their time between 3 activities: prayer, reading, and work. This formula, ora et labora, pray and work, has become the shorthand for monastic life, and it captures the ideal. The reality was that work covered an enormous range of activity, and reading required a level of literacy that had to be achieved and maintained, and the management of all of this in a functioning institution with a complex administration and a significant landed estate required skills and effort that the simple phrase does not remotely convey. Let's talk about what the work actually was. First, and most obviously, the spiritual work, the liturgy itself, which was not a passive experience. The divine office required singing, which required learning, and maintaining a substantial repertoire of chant. The choir nuns, Those who had made full profession and held the higher status within the convent were responsible for the daily and nightly performance of the liturgy, and this was skilled musical performance, not casual background devotion. Learning the chant took years. Maintaining it required regular rehearsal. The convent's musical quality mattered to its reputation and its spiritual standing, and the abbess, who presided over a musically accomplished choir, had something to be proud of. The reading specified by the rule was primarily of scripture and theological texts, and it required literacy in Latin. Because the liturgy was in Latin, the scripture was in Latin, and the theological tradition was in Latin. This meant that convents were institutions of female literacy in Latin, in a world where Latin literacy was otherwise almost exclusively male and exclusively associated with the university-educated clerical class. A Benedictine nun who had grown up in the convent from childhood and received its full education was, in terms of her linguistic training, one of the most educated women in medieval Europe. This Latin literacy was not merely passive, not just the ability to read liturgical texts that had been learned by rote. It was, in many convents and for many individual nuns, an active creative and intellectual capacity. Nuns wrote. They wrote letters, administrative documents, and accounts. They wrote spiritual reflections and mystical theology. They wrote saints' lives. They composed music. Hildegard of Bingen composed a body of liturgical music that is still performed today, and she was not the only nun to do so. They copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, producing the books that the convent needed for its liturgy and education, and that could be produced for outside clients as a commercial activity. The scriptorium, the writing room, was one of the important spaces of a well-established convent. Copying manuscripts was painstaking, skilled work that required not just literacy, but training in the specific forms of medieval script, in the preparation of vellum, animal skin prepared for writing, in the mixing and application of inks, and in the illumination that decorated the more elaborate books. Convents produced books for their own use and for sale or gift to patrons. Some convents were known for the quality of their scriptorial output, and the nuns who worked in the scriptorium were doing skilled, intellectual, and artistic work of real cultural significance. The books produced in convent scriptoria survive in libraries across Europe, some of them identified by colophons, notes added at the end of the book identifying the scribe, that name the nun who copied them. When you find a medieval manuscript that says in Latin, "Sister Margaret of this convent wrote this book, pray for her soul," you are recovering an individual medieval woman from the anonymity that the historical record usually assigns her. These scribal colophons are among the most direct forms of female authorial signature in the medieval record. Beyond the spiritual and intellectual work, the convent was a functioning economic institution that required a great deal of very practical management. A well-established medieval convent owned property, sometimes substantial property, accumulated through donations over generations, and that property had to be managed. It generated income from rents, from agricultural production on the convent's own domain lands, from mills, from fishing rights, from a range of other sources that depended on the specific endowment of the institution. Managing all of this was not a spiritual exercise. It was property management, and it required the same skills: numeracy, legal knowledge, managerial judgment, negotiation ability, that managing any significant landed estate required. The abbess, the elected head of the convent, was in legal terms the lord of the convent's estates. She presided over manorial courts, dealt with tenants and their disputes, negotiated with neighboring landowners, corresponded with bishops and royal officials, managed the convent's relationship with the outside world in all its complexity. This was a position of real power and real responsibility, and the women who held it were exercising the kind of executive authority that was otherwise almost exclusively male. The abbess of a major medieval convent was, in institutional terms, comparable to a male monastic abbot, and abbots were significant figures in medieval society, holding substantial economic and sometimes political power. the great abbesses of early medieval England, Hild of Whitby, who presided over a double monastery, housing both men and women, and hosted the famous Synod of Whitby in 664. Ethelthryth of Ely, whose abbey became one of the most important religious institutions in England, exercised authority that was, within their institutional context, genuinely comparable to that of powerful male ecclesiastics. By the later medieval period, the authority of abbacies had been curtailed in various ways. The increasing insistence of the male ecclesiastical hierarchy on enclosure, the physical confinement of nuns within the convent walls, was particularly significant because it limited abbesses' ability to interact with the outside world, and therefore their ability to exercise the kind of external political and economic power their predecessors had held. But the internal authority of the abbess within her convent remained real, and the management of the convent's internal life, the supervision of the other nuns, the maintenance of discipline, the management of the novices, the oversight of all the convent's activities, was a substantial administrative responsibility. Below the abbess, the convent had a range of offices: the prioress, her deputy; the sacrist, responsible for the church and its contents; the cellarer, responsible for food and drink; the chamberlain, responsible for clothing and bedding; the infirmarian, responsible for the sick; the novice mistress, responsible for the education and formation of new entrants. Each of these offices carried specific administrative responsibilities and required the nun holding it to develop specific areas of expertise. The cellarer's job, for instance, was essentially that of a supply chain manager and catering director, responsible for ensuring that the convent had adequate food and drink, that it was properly stored and prepared, that the kitchen and bakehouse were functioning, that the convent's agricultural and commercial resources were producing what was needed. This required knowledge of agriculture, of food management, of accounting, of the local commercial markets. It was complex institutional management performed by a woman in a context that gave her real authority over a real domain. The infirmarian's role was the convent's medical officer, responsible for the sick room, for the care of ill; sisters, for decisions about treatment and diet, and the management of chronic conditions among an aging community. This required medical knowledge of the practical herbally based kind we've already discussed, combined with the organizational capacity to manage what was effectively a small hospital within the convent's walls. Convents frequently had herb gardens, specifically cultivated for medical purposes, and the infirmarian was their primary user and often their primary cultivator. The education of children was another significant activity of many medieval convents. Convents took in young girls, sometimes for full formation as nuns, sometimes simply for education, and provided them with the basic literacy, numeracy, and religious knowledge that made them useful members of society. This was not universal. Not all convents ran schools, and the quality of convent education varied considerably. But where it existed, it represented one of the very limited formal educational options available to girls in the medieval period. Convent education was not, by the standards of the contemporary male university, philosophically sophisticated or theologically cutting edge. It was practical literacy, reading, possibly some writing, Latin for liturgical purposes, basic arithmetic, religious formation, combined with the practical domestic skills, needlework, embroidery, household management that a gentlewoman would need. But it was real education, and the girls who received it were better equipped, cognitively and practically, than those who received none. The mystical tradition deserves attention here, because it produced some of the most significant female voices in all of medieval literature, and it did so specifically because the mystical tradition offered women a path to spiritual authority that bypassed the institutional channels closed to them. Women could not be priests. They could not preach publicly. They could not teach theology in the universities. They could not hold the positions of institutional authority within the church that were reserved for ordained men, but they could have visions. They could receive divine revelations. And in a religious culture that took visions and divine revelations seriously, that accepted the possibility that God communicated directly with chosen souls. A woman who had genuine mystical experiences had a form of spiritual authority that was real, even though it operated outside the institutional framework. The great medieval women mystics, Hildegard of Bingen in 12th century Germany, Mechthild of Magdeburg in the 13th century, Julian of Norwich in 14th century England, Catherine of Siena in 14th century Italy, Marjorie Kempe in 15th century England. Each navigated the tension between the authority of their mystical experience and the institutional requirement that women's spiritual lives be supervised and validated by male ecclesiastical authority. They did it in different ways, with different degrees of success and different degrees of conflict with the church hierarchy. Julian of Norwich, who lived as an anchoress, a hermit permanently enclosed in a small cell attached to a church, wrote the Revelations of Divine Love, a work of mystical theology so sophisticated and so original that it is still read and studied today. She was the first woman to write a book in the English language that we can identify with certainty. She wrote it in English rather than Latin, partly because her Latin may not have been adequate to her theological ambitions, but also because writing in English made her work accessible to a wider non-clerical audience. She was doing theology, real, serious, philosophically sophisticated theology, in a form and a language that made it available to people outside the Latin literate clerical world. Catherine of Siena, a laywoman and tertiary Dominican rather than a nun, dictated letters to popes, to cardinals, to heads of state. She lobbied, argued, cajoled, and occasionally scolded the most powerful men in Christendom in pursuit of her theological and political goals. She had no institutional authority. She had no official position. She had her reputation for sanctity, her evident intelligence and energy, and the authority of her perceived divine mandate, and she used them to operate in political spaces normally entirely closed to women. Marjorie Kempe, a Norfolk laywoman, wife of a burgess, mother of 14 children, claimed mystical experience and the authority it conferred, traveled on pilgrimage across Europe and to Jerusalem, dictated what is often called the first autobiography in English, and was periodically accused of heresy for behavior that was considered disruptive to proper religious order. She was not a nun, she was not enclosed, she was not supervised in the ways that institutional religion preferred women to be supervised, and she was consequently a genuinely troublesome figure for the authorities. A woman claiming spiritual authority on the basis of personal experience rather than institutional position, taking that authority into the public world and refusing to be quietly contained. These women, the abbess managing her estates, the cellarer running her supply chains, the infirmarian tending her sick, the copyist working in the scriptorium, the mystic writing her theology, were doing real, skilled, significant work in a context that valued it in specific and limited ways, while simultaneously insisting that women's proper place was subordinate and their proper occupation was silent and enclosed. The convent was, in this sense, one of the great paradoxes of medieval women's history. An institution designed partly to remove women from the world and confine them in subordination to male ecclesiastical authority, which simultaneously produced some of the most educated, most administratively capable, and most intellectually significant women of the medieval period. The enclosure that was supposed to limit these women also created, in some cases, the conditions, the education, the community, the time, the resources that made their achievements possible. Now, let's leave the convent. Let's climb higher up the social pyramid. Let's go to the castle, not as a visitor, not as a servant, but as the woman in charge. Chapter 6, the noble woman's domain, running estates, raising armies, and not being decorative. You are a noble woman. Your husband is currently in France. He's been there for 7 months, which is 3 months longer than originally planned, and the letter he sent in October was not particularly informative about when he might return. You are at your principal castle in England. It is February, it is cold. and you have approximately 1,100 things to manage simultaneously. Let's be specific about what those 1,100 things are. Your castle is not just a residence, it is the administrative center of an estate that encompasses several manors, multiple villages, hundreds of tenant families who owe rents and labor services, agricultural land, woodland, mills, fish ponds, a church whose living is in your gift, and a range of other assets whose management requires constant attention. Your household, the people who live in the castle and depend on its functioning, numbers somewhere between 50 and 100 people, depending on the size of your husband's establishment. You have knights retained to your husband's service who are currently in France with him, or stationed at various properties. You have a constable managing the castle's military functions. You have a steward managing the estate's financial administration. You have a chaplain for the spiritual needs of the household. You have a substantial domestic staff. All of this reports to you. Your morning starts with your steward, who brings you the accounts, income, from rents, which tenants have paid, which have not, which have disputes about what they owe. Agricultural production from the home farm. How the winter stores are holding up. Whether additional fodder needs to be purchased for the animals. What the condition of the stored grain is. Pending legal matters. There is always a pending legal matter, because medieval estate management generated legal disputes with the dependable regularity of the seasons. A tenant claiming his obligation has been miscalculated. A neighbor whose cattle have crossed the boundary and damaged your meadow. A dispute about the boundary of a piece of woodland that has been running, off and on, for 15 years. You deal with all of this, not by deferring it to your husband's return. He will be in France until he is not, and the estate cannot wait. You write letters in your own hand or dictated to your clerk, to lawyers, and to officials, and to the stewards of other properties. You hear the complaints of your tenants directly because the manorial court, the local judicial institution through which the estate was administered, requires a presiding authority, and in your husband's absence, that is you. You sit in judgment on disputes between tenants, on questions of customary obligation, on the minor civil and criminal matters that fell within manorial jurisdiction. This was normal. This was expected. This was something that the wives of great landowners were trained for, prepared for, and understood to be part of their role, in a way that the official ideology of female subordination and the domestic sphere completely fails to capture. Margaret Paston, wife of a Norfolk landowner in the mid-15th century, whose letters survive in remarkable completeness, is perhaps the most vivid individual example of this kind of estate management. While her husband John was repeatedly in London on legal and political business, Margaret ran the family's Norfolk properties with efficiency and determination. Her letters record the full range of her managerial activity, collecting rents, dealing with recalcitrant tenants, managing the household's food supply and physical security, corresponding with lawyers about the family's perpetually contested property claims, and, most dramatically, organizing the defense of Gresham Castle when it was besieged by a rival claimant with a large force of men. Yes, besieged. Margaret Paston organized the defense of a castle while her husband was in London. She failed. The attackers were too numerous, the castle was taken, and Margaret was physically expelled from it. But the point is that she organized the defense in the first place. She made the military and logistical decisions about how to respond to a violent threat in her husband's absence. She was not passive. She was not waiting for rescue. She was managing the crisis with the resources available to her, corresponding urgently with her husband and with allies, attempting to mobilize support. And when the situation became untenable, she dealt with the aftermath. This is a woman operating in what we would normally call military and political spheres, spaces officially closed to women by the ideology of the period, because the practical demands of managing a noble household in a violent and legally contested environment required it. The gap between the official ideology and the practical reality of what noble women actually did was, in cases like this, essentially total. Margaret Paston is unusually well documented because her letters survive, but she was not unusual in what she did. The administrative records of medieval estates contain abundant evidence of women acting as estate managers, legal representatives, and household governors in their husband's absence. Letters of attorney, legal documents authorizing a person to act on behalf of another in legal matters, were regularly granted by noblemen to their wives. Before they departed on crusade, on military campaign, or on extended travel, these letters were not ceremonial gestures. They conferred real legal authority, and the women who held them exercised it. The crusading movement of the 11th through 13th centuries, which regularly took large numbers of European noblemen away from their estates for years at a time, sometimes permanently, created a structural situation in which noble wives were frequently the effective heads of their households for extended periods. The history of the Crusades, told from the perspective of the estates left behind, is substantially a history of women's management. The administrative records of crusading households show women collecting revenues, making grants of land, issuing charters, settling disputes, corresponding with the church and with royal officials, doing everything that their absent husbands would have done in their own right, with their own authority. Some noble women went further. Then estate management. There are medieval women who led military forces in their own right, who commanded troops, organized sieges, or participated directly in the military defense of their territories. These cases are exceptional, not routine, but they are real and they are documented. Matilda of Tuscany, the great 11th century Italian countess who commanded her own armies in the wars between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, was perhaps the most militarily significant woman in medieval European history, controlling territory across northern Italy and exercising a military and political power that most of her male contemporaries could not match. She was exceptional in the scale of her power, but not entirely isolated in its nature. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen first of France and then of England, ruler of the Duchy of Aquitaine, in her own right, participated in the Second Crusade, managed the political affairs of her kingdoms during her husband's absences, survived a 15-year imprisonment by her second husband, Henry II, and in her 70s was still riding across Europe to manage the political crises of her son Richard I's reign. She is one of the most remarkable people of the medieval period, regardless of gender, but she exercised her power through the same institutional structures, land ownership, legal authority, political alliance, that all medieval power depended on. The wardship system, by which the king or a great lord took control of the estates of a minor heir, created situations in which widows who were not themselves under wardship might exercise significant independent authority over their own inherited properties. Widowhood was, paradoxically, the legal status that gave medieval women the most freedom. The widow was in law, a femme sole, legally independent, able to own property, make contracts, and conduct legal business in her own name. Wealthy widows were therefore, in strict legal terms, among the freest women in medieval society. This is why wealthy widows were so politically significant and so persistently pressured to remarry. A widow with substantial property was an independent economic and political actor, and that independence was both valuable and threatening to the men around her who wanted access to her resources. Kings pressured widows into remarriages that served royal political purposes. Families pressured widows into remarriages that kept property within specific kin networks. The widow, who successfully resisted these pressures and maintained her independence, and some did, was exercising a form of female autonomy that the official social structure was specifically designed to prevent. The Magna Carta of 1215 contains specific clauses about widows' rights, guaranteeing that widows could not be compelled to remarry against their will, that they could have their dower, the portion of their husband's estate guaranteed to them for life, promptly on. Widowhood. These clauses were included because the pressure on widows to remarry under compulsion was real enough and common enough to require legal protection. The need for the legal protection tells us something about how frequently that protection was needed. Let's also talk about women and education at the noble level, because the education of noble girls was more substantive than is often assumed, and it shaped what noble women could do in the world. The literacy rate among noble women was higher than among the general female population, and in the later medieval period probably comparable to or exceeding that of many noble men. This was partly because the church's emphasis on religious literacy encouraged women's reading. A woman who could read her own prayers and her own devotional literature, which was considered spiritually desirable. It was also because practical literacy was useful in managing a household and estate, and the women who needed to write letters and writ accounts found it worth acquiring. Noble girls received their education in various ways. In convents, where, as we've seen, the educational provision was real if limited. In the households of great ladies, where they served as gentlewomen in training and learned by observation and practice the management of a noble household. And at home, from tutors or from literate family members. By the later medieval period, some noble girls received educations that included not just reading and writing in the vernacular, but some Latin, some French, some knowledge of literature and history, and the practical skills of household management. Christine de Pizan, the professional writer working in early 15th century France, whose life we'll discuss more in a moment, wrote a book specifically designed to educate noble women in the full range of skills their lives required, the Book of the Three Virtues, also known as The Treasure of the City of Ladies. Her curriculum included the management of estates and finances, the supervision of servants, the exercise of political influence through their husbands and through their own relationships, the management of domestic religious practice, and, significantly, the management of their own estates in their husband's absence. It's a practical handbook for exactly the kind of multifaceted female authority we've been describing, written by a woman who understood from observation and from her own experience what the reality of noble women's lives actually looked like. Christine de Pizan herself is worth a moment's attention because she represents something that the medieval period usually refused to accommodate. The woman who made her living as a professional writer, in her own name, on her own account. Christine was the daughter of a court astrologer at the French royal court, educated beyond the norm for women of her time, widowed young with children to support. She turned to writing to support her family, or initially producing poetry in the courtly tradition, then increasingly ambitious prose, works addressing history, political theory, ethical philosophy, and women's history and status. She wrote for patrons at the highest levels of French society, including the royal family. She argued, in the Book of the City of Ladies, for the intelligence, virtue, and historical significance of women, against the misogynist literary tradition that was the dominant framework for thinking about women in medieval culture. She was arguing against centuries of accumulated literary tradition, against the weight of theological interpretation, against the output of the university-educated male intellectual class. She was doing it in writing in her own name, from her position as a professional author at the court of France. She was, in short, doing something that the official medieval worldview said women didn't and shouldn't do. And she was doing it well enough that her work was read, preserved, and is still studied today. Christine is exceptional in her visibility and her explicit intellectual ambition. But the women we've been discussing throughout this chapter, the estate manager, the commercial operator, the abbess, the mystic, were all, in their different ways, operating in spaces that the official ideology said weren't theirs. They were all doing it anyway. They were all doing it because the world required them to, or because they had the capacity and the opportunity, or because they simply refused to accept the limits that the official story prescribed. The official story of medieval women is a story of limitation, of legal subordination, of theological condemnation, of exclusion from power and knowledge in public life. That story is real. The limitations were real. The subordination was real, and it was enforced, sometimes harshly. But the reality of what women actually did is a different story. A story of competence, of adaptability, of navigating around and through the formal restrictions, of exercising authority in the spaces that were available, even when those spaces were defined as limited. It's a story that gets more interesting the more carefully you look at it. And we're not done looking. Chapter 7. Sex, Marriage, and Surviving Both. the politics of the medieval female body. You are a girl. You are 14 years old, and your father has just told you that you are going to be married. The man you are going to marry is 26. You have met him twice. The first time was at a feast at your uncle's house, where you were seated at the far end of the table and didn't speak to him directly. The second time was last week, when he came to your father's house with his own father and 2 lawyers, and everyone sat in the main hall for 3 hours discussing land. You served wine. Nobody asked your opinion. The wedding is in 6 weeks. How you feel about this depends enormously on who you are. If you are a peasant, girl, the marriage was probably arranged with more input from you than the scenario above suggests. Peasant marriages, because they involved fewer assets and less political complexity, tended to have more room for personal preference. And there is real historical evidence that ordinary people cared about whether their children were willing participants in their marriages. If you are a wealthy heiress, the scenario above is not an exaggeration, and the assets being discussed in that 3-hour meeting are substantially you, your body, your fertility, your inherited land, your father's political connections, all packaged together into a transaction that will determine the next several decades of your life. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not primarily a romantic institution. It was an economic and political one. This is not a cynical observation. It was simply a different framework, one in which the arrangement of marriages was a rational response to the realities of property, transmission, political alliance, and household formation in a world without the social safety nets that allow modern people to pair off on the basis of feeling alone. But the framework had consequences for women that were substantial, complex, and worth understanding in detail, because what happened to a woman in marriage, the terms she lived under, the legal and social realities of her married life, determined almost everything about her daily existence. Let's start with the legal framework, because it shaped everything else. In medieval England, and with variations elsewhere in Europe, marriage created a legal entity called the couple, in which the husband was, in law, the dominant party. The doctrine of coverture, as we've mentioned, subsumed the legal identity of the wife into that of the husband. She could not own property independently, could not make contracts independently, could not sue or be sued in her own name for most purposes. Her property became his on marriage. Her legal identity was, in the official framework, merged into his. This was the official framework. The reality, as we've already seen in our discussion of urban women and noble estate managers, was considerably more complicated. But the legal framework mattered because it determined what happened when things went wrong, when the husband was abusive, or financially reckless, or simply absent or dead. The church's role in marriage regulation is central to understanding medieval marriage, because the medieval church claimed jurisdiction over marriage as a sacrament, and from the 12th century onward spent considerable energy developing and enforcing a marriage law that was, in some ways, more protective of women's interests than the secular law it coexisted with. The canonical requirements for a valid marriage, as developed by church lawyers and theologians through the 12th and 13th centuries, included 2 elements that were genuinely significant. Both parties had to consent freely to the marriage, and the consent had to be expressed verbally in the present tense. The free consent of both parties was, in theory, required for a valid marriage. Without it, the marriage was not a marriage in the eyes of the church and could be annulled. This is more significant than it sounds. The requirement of consent gave women, in theory, a veto over their own marriages. If a woman could establish before an ecclesiastical court that she had been coerced, had consented under duress, the marriage was invalid. The church court system was, in fact, used by some medieval women to escape marriages they had not freely entered or to establish the validity of marriages their families opposed. The gap between the theory of consent and its practical operation was, of course, considerable. Establishing coercion before a court required testimony, legal representation, and the courage to oppose a family that might be powerful and angry. Many women who were coerced into marriages did not have the resources or the support to challenge them. The social pressure to marry whom your family designated was enormous, and women who resisted could face consequences, ranging from family disapproval to physical confinement. But the legal possibility was real, and it was used. The ecclesiastical court records of medieval England contain cases of women asserting their consent rights, claiming marriages they wanted that their families opposed, escaping marriages they had been pressured into. The famous case of clandestine marriage, marriage contracted privately between two parties, without the formal public ceremony and without family involvement, was a genuine legal category in medieval canon law, valid if the consent was freely given and genuinely expressed, regardless of whether anyone else had been consulted. Some young people used clandestine marriage as a strategy for marrying the person they chose, rather than the person their families designated. The Church's marriage law was also the framework within which the complicated question of sexuality was managed, and the medieval Church's approach to sexuality was, to put it diplomatically, not uncomplicated. The Church's official position was that sexual intercourse was legitimated only within marriage, and only for the purpose of procreation. Sexual pleasure was at best a tolerated byproduct of the legitimate reproductive purpose of marital sex, not a positive good in itself. Sexual intercourse outside marriage was sin. Sexual intercourse within marriage, but using contraception, was sin. Sexual intercourse within marriage for pleasure rather than procreation was sinful, or at least dubious. The catalog of sexual sins in the penitentials, the manuals used by priests to assign penances for confessed sins, runs to impressive length and considerable specificity. This official framework had real consequences for women because it shaped how the Church and the law responded to sexual violence, to reproductive autonomy, and to the management of women's sexuality more broadly. The medieval law of rape is one of the most revealing areas of medieval gender relations, and it is not comfortable reading. Rape in the medieval legal framework was defined primarily as a property crime against a man. The violation of his daughter or wife damaged his property and his honor. The woman's experience was legally secondary to the man's loss. The penalties were real, but the practical barriers to prosecution were substantial. A woman who accused a man of rape needed to have reported it promptly, needed to demonstrate that she had resisted, needed witnesses or physical evidence, and needed the social standing and support to pursue the case through a court system that was skeptical of female testimony and inclined to assume female complicity. The doctrine that a woman could not become pregnant from rape derived from a misunderstanding of reproductive biology that held that pregnancy required female pleasure and that pregnancy therefore demonstrated consent was a genuine piece of medieval medical and legal thought that appeared in serious legal treatises. Its consequences for rape victims who became pregnant were severe. Pregnancy could be used as evidence against a charge of rape, on the grounds that conception proved consent. Women who experienced sexual violence within marriage had essentially no legal recourse. The medieval law did not recognize marital rape as a legal category because a wife was understood to have given permanent consent to sex with her husband at the point of marriage. The legal concept of conjugal debt, the obligation of each spouse to be sexually available to the other on request, was a genuine part of medieval canon law, and it applied to husbands and wives symmetrically in theory, but in practice, the power differential meant that its consequences fell primarily on women. None of this is comfortable, and none of it should be sanitized. The legal framework within which medieval women's sexuality was managed was deeply disadvantageous to women in multiple ways. But it is also not the whole story, because the law and the lived reality were not identical, and women navigated the reality with the resources available to them. Let's talk about pregnancy and childbirth, because they were realities that structured women's lives in ways that have no modern parallel. A medieval woman who married in her teens and survived to her 40s could expect to be pregnant or nursing or recovering from pregnancy for a very large proportion of her adult life. Contraception was known. Various herbal preparations were used, some of which had genuine efficacy, and barrier and other methods were practiced, but it was theoretically prohibited by the Church and practically unreliable. The result was that women in stable marriages in conditions of adequate nutrition, frequently had many pregnancies. Not all of those pregnancies produced living children. Miscarriage was common. Stillbirth was common. Infant death in the first year of life was common. A woman who gave birth 10 times and raised 5 children to adulthood had not experienced unusual loss by medieval standards. The psychological dimension of this, the repeated experience of pregnancy, the labor and care invested in children who then died, the grief managed in a context where child death was expected but not therefore unfelt, is something the historical record largely leaves us to imagine because grief was a private experience that the sources rarely preserved. The physical toll of repeated childbearing was real and substantial. Obstetric fistula, a tear between the vaginal wall and the bladder or rectum caused by prolonged, difficult labor, was a genuine hazard that could make a woman incontinent for life and was socially devastating in its consequences. Iron deficiency anemia from repeated childbearing was common. The cumulative physical demands of pregnancy and nursing, combined with the physical demands of daily labor, meant that many medieval women's bodies were under sustained physical stress throughout their adult lives. The rituals surrounding childbirth are worth noting because they tell us something about how medieval society understood and managed this dangerous female experience. The churching of women, the ritual purification and thanksgiving ceremony performed about a month after childbirth, was a significant ceremony in medieval religious life. A woman who had recently given birth was considered ritually impure by a tradition derived from Levitical law, and was not supposed to enter the church until she had been churched. The ceremony that readmitted her to the church community was also a celebration of her survival, an acknowledgement that she had passed through a dangerous trial and come out the other side. The period between delivery and churching was a female space. The new mother was surrounded by female relatives and neighbors. The gossips from godsibs, meaning godparents and close associates, who helped manage the household during her recovery. This female community at the moment of new motherhood was one of the significant spaces of female solidarity in medieval life. A moment when the ordinary social hierarchy was temporarily suspended and women gathered around one of their own in support. Let's talk about love, because it existed. Medieval people fell in love, wanted to be with specific people, felt the full range of human emotional experience that we associate with romantic attachment. The historical record contains love letters, love poetry, accounts of elopements, of marriages contracted against family opposition, of relationships maintained despite social disapproval. The idea that medieval people were too pragmatic or too constrained to experience romantic love is simply wrong. Human emotional experience doesn't change that fundamentally across the centuries. The courtly love tradition, the elaborate literary and social game of romantic devotion that dominated aristocratic culture from the 12th century onward, has been interpreted in many ways, but it represents, at minimum, an acknowledgement that desire and longing and the experience of romantic love were real and significant human experiences worth celebrating in poetry and song. The troubadours of southern France, the poets of the courtly tradition, the writers of romance, they were writing about something that their audiences recognized and responded to, which means they were writing about something real in the human experience of their contemporaries. Whether courtly love translated into actual sexual relationships between the knights who declared their devotion and the ladies who were its objects is a question that medieval literary historians have debated at length without arriving at consensus. What seems clear is that the courtly love tradition gave noble women a specific kind of cultural power. The power to be the object of poetic devotion, to set the terms of the game, to judge the competitors for their attention. This power was real within the cultural framework that created it, even if it didn't translate into legal authority or institutional power. The popular literature of the period, the fabliaux, the comic tales that circulated in urban environments and dealt with considerably less refined versions of human sexuality than the courtly love tradition, presents a very different picture of female sexuality. The clever wife who outsmarts her husband, the sexually voracious widow, the resourceful serving girl, who manages her own interests with sharp humor and quick thinking. These are not flattering portraits in any simple sense. They often depend on the assumption that female sexuality is inherently deceptive and destabilizing, but they do present women as agents with desires and strategies of their own, which is more than the official theology managed. The widow again occupies a special position in the sexual politics of the medieval period. The widow, particularly the wealthy widow, was a figure of significant social anxiety because she combined legal independence with sexual experience and, the culture assumed, continuing sexual desire. The remarrying widow was a source of both social comedy, the henpecked new husband, the cuckold, and genuine social concern, the widow's assets being controlled by someone outside the original family. The widow who chose not to remarry, who maintained her legal independence, was subject to pressure, but also, if she could resist it, genuinely free in ways that no other female category was. Chaucer's wife of Bath, the most famous female character in medieval English literature, is a widow 5 times over who deploys her sexual experience and her formidable personality as the primary currency of her marriages. She is a comic figure, and the comedy is partly at her expense, but she is also a vehicle through which Chaucer engages seriously with questions about female authority, female desire, and the politics of marriage, and she gets to speak for herself at length with wit and force. She is not a realistic portrait of a medieval woman, but she is a portrait of what medieval culture found threatening and fascinating about female autonomy, and that tells us something real. Marriage, then, was the central institution of medieval women's lives, the framework within which most women lived, the arrangement that determined their legal status, their economic position, their reproductive experience, and their daily existence. It was an institution they had limited power to choose and limited power to exit, but it was also an institution they inhabited actively, with intelligence and strategy, and when conditions permitted, with genuine affection and partnership. The medieval marriage that worked, and many of them did, in the sense of producing functional, even affectionate partnerships between people who had initially been strangers to each other, was a form of collaboration under constraint. The letters of Margaret and John Paston, whose correspondence we've already mentioned, contain genuine warmth alongside the business. The evidence of mourning in medieval wills and memorials reflects real loss. People loved each other. They grieved each other. The institutional framework was harsh and unequal, but the human reality inside it was the full range of human experience. Now let's look at the women for whom the institutional framework broke down entirely, who fell outside it or refused it, or were pushed outside it by circumstances beyond their control. Chapter 8. Women on the margins. Outcasts, rebels, and women who refused. Not every medieval woman married. Not every medieval woman entered a convent. Not every medieval woman fit neatly into the categories that medieval society had prepared for her. And the women who didn't fit, who fell through the cracks, or jumped through them deliberately, or were pushed, had experiences that tell us as much about medieval society as the experiences of those who stayed within its boundaries. Let's start with the most visible category of marginal women, the poor. Poverty in the medieval period was not an abstract condition. It was a physical reality with specific daily consequences. Not enough food, inadequate shelter, clothing insufficient to protect against the cold, vulnerability to every illness and every economic shock that a better resourced person could survive. Women were disproportionately represented among the medieval poor for reasons that were structural and that the social organization of the period did little to address. Widows without resources were among the most vulnerable people in medieval society. A woman whose husband died, leaving significant debt, or no estate, or children too young to contribute economically, was in a precarious position with very limited options. She could remarry, which depended on finding someone willing to take her and her dependents. She could return to her family of origin, which depended on her family being willing and able to receive her. She could work in whatever capacity was available. And the work available to a poor widow was largely the lowest paid, most physically demanding, least secure work in the urban or rural economy. The category of poor woman in medieval urban records is not monolithic. It includes widows of craftsmen whose businesses had failed, women who had never married and had exhausted the support of whatever family they had, women who had migrated to cities from rural areas in search of work and found the city harder than they had anticipated, women whose health or age had reduced their capacity to earn. The medieval city's charitable institutions, the hospitals, the almshouses, the charitable foundations attached to churches, were partly designed to address the needs of exactly these women, though the institution's capacity was always far short of the need. The vagrant woman, moving from place to place without fixed settlement, working whatever was available along the way, was a figure that medieval authorities found deeply disturbing. Medieval society organized itself around fixed communities, stable identities, known individuals with known histories. The person without a fixed place, the vagrant, the wanderer, the person who couldn't tell you exactly where they came from and who vouched for their character, was inherently suspect because the social control mechanisms of the medieval world depended on community knowledge and community accountability. A vagrant woman was doubly suspicious because a woman without the supervision of a husband or a household or a religious community was, in the medieval framework, a woman without the proper governance that female nature supposedly required. The assumption that an unattached, mobile woman must be sexually available or sexually disreputable was widespread and consequential. It made vagrant women vulnerable to harassment and assault, and it made their position in whatever community they passed through genuinely precarious. The prostitute was the woman who had, in the official view, entirely abandoned the proper female virtues, chastity, modesty, the management of sexuality within sanctioned relationships, and placed herself in a category of permanent moral pollution. Medieval attitudes toward prostitution were complicated. Augustine's argument that prostitution, while sinful, served a social function by channeling male lust away from respectable women was widely cited. Thomas Aquinas endorsed a version of it. Most medieval cities tolerated prostitution rather than attempting to suppress it, often in specific, designated areas. The red light districts of medieval cities, located in specific streets or quarters, known to everyone and regulated imperfectly by civic authorities. The regulation of prostitution in medieval cities was as much about controlling the women involved as about managing the institution itself. Prostitutes in many cities were required to wear distinguishing clothing, a striped hood, a particular colored garment, that identified them publicly. They were excluded from certain civic spaces, restricted from certain activities, designated as a distinct category of person who existed outside the protections and the obligations of normal civic life. But the actual women doing this work were not abstractions. They were women, often very young women, often women with few or no alternative options, often women who had entered this life through some combination of poverty, coercion, seduction, and desperation. The path from economic vulnerability to prostitution was often short and steep. The servant who was assaulted by her employer and lost her position, the migrant woman with no community support, the girl whose family could not or would not maintain her. Medieval sources occasionally record the specific stories of individual women, and those stories are rarely simple tales of moral failure. They are stories of limited options and bad circumstances. The possibility of exit from prostitution was officially offered by the church through the Magdalene houses, institutions founded to provide reformed prostitutes with an alternative, usually the religious life. These institutions, named for Mary Magdalene, who was, incorrectly, as modern scholars note, but persistently in medieval tradition, identified as the reformed prostitute of the Gospels, existed in various medieval cities and provided some women with genuine alternatives. The reformed prostitute who became a nun was a figure with real religious significance. The ultimate conversion narrative, the most complete possible transformation of a sinful life. Now let's talk about women who actively refuse the categories available to them. who pushed back against the constraints of their situation in ways that left traces in the historical record. The woman accused of witchcraft is perhaps the most charged figure in the popular imagination of medieval women's history, and also one of the most misunderstood. The Great Witch Trials that destroyed thousands of women, primarily women, across Europe, were largely a phenomenon of the early modern period, the 15th through 17th centuries, not the medieval period proper. The legal and theological framework for mass witch prosecution was developed primarily in the 15th century, with the publication of texts like the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487, which is technically just within our period, but represents the very end of it and the beginning of something much worse. During most of the medieval period proper, the Church's official position on witchcraft was actually skeptical. The influential 10th century canon Episcopi explicitly stated that women who believed they flew through the night with Diana and other supernatural figures were suffering from delusion, not actually doing it. This didn't prevent local accusations, local violence, and the occasional local prosecution, but it meant that the systematic, theologically justified mass persecution of women for witchcraft was not a medieval phenomenon in the same way that it became an early modern one. What was a medieval phenomenon was the accusation of magic, the use of supernatural means to cause harm, maleficium, as a real and prosecutable offense. Medieval people believed in magic as a genuine force, and they sometimes accused specific individuals, often women, of using it. These accusations tended to cluster around specific social situations, disputes between neighbors, illness or death that needed explanation, the coincidence of misfortune with a hostile relationship, the old woman whose curse was followed by the death of a cow, the midwife whose infant patient died after an unusual delivery, the healer whose herbal remedy failed. These were figures who might attract accusation in specific circumstances, but the women who refused in ways we can most clearly see in the historical record are often the women who engage with the institutional church on their own terms, who claimed religious authority through mystical experience, who pushed the boundaries of what women were permitted to do and say in the religious sphere. We've already discussed the mystics, but let's add a figure who represents a different kind of refusal, the Beguine. The Beguines were women, primarily from the urban middle and upper classes of Northern Europe, particularly in the Low Countries and the Rhine Valley, who in the 12th and 13th centuries created a new form of religious life that didn't fit any of the existing categories. They weren't nuns. They didn't take formal vows. They didn't live under a religious rule. They didn't submit to the authority of a bishop or an abbot. They weren't lay people in the conventional sense. They lived communally. They followed a devotional routine. They identified as religious women. They existed in a category of their own creation. The Beguines often lived together in communities called beguinages, supporting themselves through skilled work, particularly textile work, while devoting significant time to prayer, study, and care for the sick and poor. They were educated, often significantly so. They read and wrote in the vernacular languages, their mystical writings in Middle Dutch and Middle High German and Middle French are among the most significant literary productions of the medieval religious world. Mechtild of Magdeburg, Hadewijk of Antwerp, and Marguerite Porete were all Beguines, or Beguine-adjacent figures, and their writings are extraordinary works of mystical theology and vernacular literature. The institutional church was deeply uncomfortable with the Beguines. Women living in independent religious communities without male oversight, outside the traditional monastic framework. Writing theology, this was the kind of thing that made ecclesiastical authorities nervous. The Beguine movement was periodically accused of heresy, sometimes fairly. Marguerite Porete was burned for heresy in 1310 for her mystical work, The Mirror of Simple Souls, and sometimes as a pretext for institutional control. The Council of Vienne in 1311-12 issued regulations restricting the Beguines, though the movement proved too large and too socially embedded to be easily suppressed. What the Beguines represent is a large group of women, thousands of them across Northern Europe, who found the options officially available to them, marriage or the convent, inadequate, and created a third option for themselves. They did it without official permission. They did it in the face of persistent institutional skepticism, and they maintained it for generations in the face of periodic suppression because it met real needs, their own needs for a religious life that engaged their intelligence and their spirituality, and the needs of the communities they served through their charitable work. There were also the women who refused in smaller, less documented ways, who negotiated the constraints of their situations in the daily, practical, mostly unrecorded ways that don't produce the dramatic historical record of a Marjorie Kempe or a Margaret Paston, but that nonetheless represented real human agency in difficult circumstances. The woman who managed to maintain her own small commercial operation despite the restrictions of coverture by operating under the Femi Soul doctrine while remaining married. The woman who used the confessional and the penitential system to establish a degree of spiritual autonomy within a marriage that constrained her in other ways. The woman who cultivated a reputation for medical knowledge and healing skill that gave her standing in her community that the official hierarchy hadn't granted her. The woman who simply refused to be quiet when the social expectation was silence. Joan of Arc sits in a category entirely her own. The peasant girl from Lorraine who claimed divine visions, dressed in men's clothing, led armies, and was burned at the stake for heresy in 1431. But she is perhaps the most dramatic illustration in all of medieval history of what happened when a woman stepped entirely outside the categories her society had prepared for her. Joan's case is complex and has been interpreted in approximately 10,000 different ways across the 6 centuries since her death. But in the context of our discussion, she represents something very specific. What happened when a woman claimed the kind of direct divine authority that the mystical tradition permitted in theory, and then acted on it in the most public, most politically consequential, most thoroughly male domain that medieval society had, the battlefield and the royal court. She was accepted for a time because the political and military circumstances of France in the 1420s were desperate enough that the option she offered, a visionary military leader who claimed divine backing for the Dauphin's cause, was worth trying. She was effective. She genuinely turned the military situation. And then when she was captured and her political usefulness to her enemies as a tool for discrediting the Dauphin was greater than her military usefulness to the French was, she was tried, convicted, and burned. The charges against her included wearing men's clothing, cross-dressing, which was a genuine offense in medieval law and theology. Her insistence on wearing male dress was partly practical. Armor doesn't work as well over a dress, and partly it seems a genuine assertion that the role she had taken on required the body's clothing to match the role's demands. The charge was used against her in her trial, and her temporary recantation and then reassumption of male dress gave her accusers the relapse they needed to condemn her as an unrepentant heretic. Joan's story is not, in the end, a story of medieval society accepting a woman who refused its categories. It is a story of what happened to such a woman when she became politically inconvenient. But the fact that she existed, that she did what she did, that she is part of the medieval historical record at all, tells us something about the range of what medieval women were capable of when circumstances created the opening for it. The marginal women, the poor widow, the vagrant, the beguine, the mystic, the woman who found her own way through the constraints, are the women who most clearly reveal both the limitations of the medieval social framework and the human capacity to navigate those limitations. They were not passive. They were not simply victims of a system they couldn't influence. They made decisions with the options available to them. They pushed against the boundaries when they could, and they left traces in the historical record that, if we look carefully enough, tell us something real about the extraordinary range of medieval female experience. Chapter 9. What changed? What didn't? The arc of 1,000 years. We've been moving through the medieval period somewhat as though it were a single moment, as though the peasant woman of 750 and the merchant's wife of 1450 inhabited the same world in all the ways that matter. In the broad strokes of our discussion, that comparison has been useful. But the medieval period spans roughly 1,000 years, and things changed across that span in ways that directly affected women's lives, women's options, and women's position in society. Let's try to capture the arc. The early medieval period, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, is in some ways the most difficult to reconstruct because the sources are sparse and heavily biased toward the ecclesiastical. What we can say is that the Germanic societies that reshaped Western Europe after the fall of Rome had their own traditions regarding women's legal capacity and social role, which were in some ways more accommodating than the Roman law tradition that gradually reasserted itself. Germanic law codes, the Salic law of the Franks, the Visigothic code, the laws of the Anglo-Saxons, accorded women legal standing in various ways that the later development of Roman law traditions tended to reduce. Women in early medieval Germanic society could own property, could inherit, could bring legal cases, could make wills. The Wehrgild, the compensation paid for killing a person, the foundation of early medieval legal systems, had a female rate as well as a male one, meaning that women were recognized as individuals whose killing or injury carried a legal price. Anglo-Saxon England is a particularly interesting case because the evidence for Anglo-Saxon women's legal and economic capacity is relatively good. The law codes are preserved, some wills survive, and the Domesday Book of 1086, technically Norman rather than Anglo-Saxon, but recording an Anglo-Saxon world, names female landholders who held significant properties in their own right. Anglo-Saxon noblewomen could and did control substantial landed wealth, make pious donations to the church, commission manuscripts, and exercise influence in the political sphere. The Norman conquest of 1066 and the subsequent development of common law in England is generally understood by historians as having negative consequences for women's legal position. The development of the common law doctrine of coverture, the systematization of primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, and the general tightening of the legal framework around property all tended to restrict women's capacity relative to the more fluid earlier situation. This is a consistent pattern. The development of more systematic, more bureaucratic, more formalized legal and administrative systems tended to work against women because formalization codified the ideological assumptions of its creators, who were male. The 12th century was a pivotal period for several of the developments most relevant to women's history. The rise of the universities, exclusively male institutions from their inception, created a new kind of intellectual authority based on formal credentials rather than birth or experience, and that authority was specifically closed to women. The development of systematic church law, including the marriage law we've discussed, created both new protections and new restrictions. The growth of towns and commercial economies created new economic opportunities that women exploited, and new institutional frameworks, guilds, civic law, that tried to limit their exploitation. The courtly love tradition, which developed in the 12th century, gave aristocratic women a specific kind of cultural authority, the authority of the beloved, the authority of the arbiter of courtly values, that was real within its cultural framework, but carefully contained, so as not to challenge the actual institutional power structure. The literature of courtly love is full of powerful, admirable women, but they are powerful in the literary imagination, which was safer than being powerful in the institutional reality. The 13th and 14th centuries saw the development of female religious life in new directions. The Beguines, the female tertiaries, attached to the mendicant orders, the explosion of women's mystical writing. These movements represented women's attempt to create spiritual lives adequate to their intelligence and their devotion within a church that officially restricted their options, and they produced some of the most remarkable religious writing of the period. The Black Death of the mid-14th century had complex and somewhat paradoxical effects on women's position. In the immediate aftermath, the severe labor shortage drove wages up, and created opportunities for women as workers in crafts and trades that had previously been more restricted to men. The disruption of existing social structures created some openings for female economic activity. But the longer-term response, as economic recovery proceeded and male workers sought to consolidate their position in the expanding economy, often involved the restriction of women's access to the economic gains that the labor shortage had temporarily created. The late 14th and 15th century saw in many urban crafts the progressive exclusion of women from guilds and the restriction of their formal participation in skilled trades. The 15th century is also the century of the early witch trials, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Council of Basel's discussions of witchcraft, the beginning of the systematic theological and legal framework that would enable the mass persecution of the early modern period, the precise reasons why the late medieval period generated this development, why the misogynist strand of medieval thought that had always been present became organized into a system of lethal persecution at this specific moment, are debated by historians, but the pattern is clear. As the medieval period ended, the position of women at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy became, if anything, more dangerous. The invention of printing in the 1450s created new opportunities for women's writing and women's voices to circulate. Christine de Pizan's works were among the earliest texts to be printed, but also amplified the misogynist tradition, giving wider circulation to texts that argued for female inferiority, deception, and danger. The honest summary of the arc across the 1,000 years of the medieval period is not one of steady progress or steady decline. It is more complicated and more ambiguous than either narrative allows. In some periods, in some places, in some social contexts, women's options expanded or their position improved in specific measurable ways. In others, formalization and institutionalization worked against them. The legal frameworks that governed their lives varied by region, by period, and by social class, in ways that make generalization treacherous. What is consistent across the whole period is the gap, the consistent, persistent, enormous gap between the official ideology of female subordination and the actual reality of what women did, knew, managed, created, and accomplished. That gap is the most important thing we've found in this entire investigation, because it tells us something that transcends the medieval period and speaks to something permanent in the human situation. The ideology said women were the weaker vessel. The reality was the peasant woman who got up before dawn for 40 years and kept her household alive. The ideology said women couldn't reason adequately for positions of authority. The reality was the abbess managing her estates, the merchant's widow running her business, the noblewoman organizing her castle's defense. The ideology said women's proper place was in silent subjection. The reality was Hildegard of Bingen writing theology, Christine de Pizan arguing for female dignity, Julian of Norwich exploring the nature of divine love with philosophical sophistication. The ideology was loudly stated, the reality was quietly lived, and the reality was, by almost any measure, more interesting. Conclusion: the women history almost forgot you are a woman. The year is 1186, and you got up before dawn. You have been awake for 16 hours. The fire is banked for the night. The children are asleep. The bread is ready to start rising for tomorrow's morning. Your hands are rough. Your back aches. Tomorrow will be, substantially, the same as today. And you have done, in this single day, more than most people in your society will ever record or remember or acknowledge. You have fed people. You have kept a household functioning. You have exercised skills that took years to acquire. You have made dozens of decisions, managed half a dozen concurrent processes, navigated the social landscape of your community with the care and attention that keeping relationships functional requires. You have, in short, kept the world going, your small corner of it, the corner that was yours to tend. No one will write this down. The chronicler in his monastery is recording the movements of armies and the decisions of kings. The lawyer in the town is recording the transactions of his wealthy clients. The herald is recording the deeds of knights. The world that most of the historical record preserves is not your world, but your world was real. It was as real as theirs, more real in many ways, because the daily work of feeding and clothing and healing and teaching and maintaining the fabric of ordinary life was the foundation on which all the armies and courts and chronicles rested. Without you, none of the rest of it was possible. Without the work of women across every level of medieval society, the medieval world does not function. It simply does not function. This is what the evidence tells us when we look at it carefully. The peasant women in the harvest fields, the urban women in their workshops and markets, the nuns in their scriptoria and infirmaries, the noble women in their estate offices, the mystics in their cells, the merchants' wives in their counting houses. They were all there, doing essential things, exercising real skills, navigating real constraints with real intelligence. They were doing all of it in a world that was institutionally and ideologically organized to deny that they were doing it, to minimize it, to classify it as secondary, to render it invisible against the backdrop of male achievement that the official historical record preferred to foreground. The recovery of their history, the patient, careful, evidence-based reconstruction of what women actually did all day in the Middle Ages is one of the important scholarly achievements of the last half-century of historical research. It is not complete. There are still gaps, still voices we cannot recover, still experiences that left no trace in the records we can find. But the picture that has emerged is dramatically richer, more complex, and more impressive than the one that the traditional narrative provided. Women in the Middle Ages were not waiting. They were not decorative. They were not passive. They were not simply the background against which male history happened. They were doing the work. They were managing the institutions. They were writing the books, running the businesses, healing the sick, raising the children, producing the food, and the cloth and the ale that everyone depended on. They were arguing with popes, defending castles, managing estates, composing music, and occasionally, when the opportunity arose and the circumstances permitted, changing the world. The story of what women actually did all day in the Middle Ages is, in the end, not a story about limitation. It is a story about what human beings do when they are capable and determined and have no choice but to get on with it. They get on with it. They always have.